When 60-year-old Harold fixed a stranded biker's flat tire in front of his house, he thought it was just another quiet morning act of kindness, but the next day, the thunderous roar of 80 Harley-Davidsons filled his suburban street as an entire chapter of Hell's Angels rolled up to his front door. What started as one old man's simple gesture had triggered something so powerful that it would transform his neighborhood forever and remind everyone what true brotherhood really looks like. But what did those 80 bikers actually do when they surrounded Harold's house, and why did this one act of kindness create a moment that would change everything? The desert sun blazed mercilessly at 9 in the morning, transforming Harold Brennan's quiet suburban street into a ribbon of shimmering asphalt that stretched between rows of modest homes where retirees like himself had settled into the gentle rhythm of Arizona's endless summers. Their small front yards, dotted with barrel cacti and desert sage that somehow managed to thrive in soil that seemed better suited for burial than blooming. Harold stepped onto his sun-bleached front porch, the same ritual he'd performed every morning for the past 15 years since Martha's funeral. His calloused fingers wrapped around a ceramic coffee mug that bore the faded logo of Brennan's Auto Repair, the shop he'd owned and operated for 4 decades before arthritis forced him into reluctant retirement at an age when other men were just hitting their stride. The familiar weight of the mug grounded him as he surveyed his small kingdom. The neat flower beds his late wife had planted with desert marigolds and prickly pear, their vibrant blooms a defiant splash of color against the beige uniformity of the neighborhood. The American flag hanging motionless in the still air, like a prayer frozen in time. The cracked driveway, where oil stains told stories of countless repairs he'd performed for neighbors who couldn't afford a real mechanic, but trusted Harold's hands more than any fancy shop downtown. The morning air carried the familiar scents of his retirement brewing coffee, cooling asphalt, the faint perfume of his late wife's flowers mixed with desert dust that settled on everything like a fine layer of memory, and Harold allowed himself the luxury of contentment, a feeling that had taken years to cultivate after the devastating silence that followed first Michael's death and then Martha's, leaving him alone in a house that had once echoed with laughter and conversation and the comfortable sounds of family life lived fully. The thunderous roar that shattered this peaceful moment made Harold carefully set his coffee mug on the porch railing, the sudden movement causing him to steady himself against the wooden post as a massive Harley-Davidson choked and sputtered to a violent stop directly in front of his house, black smoke billowing from its chrome exhaust, like the dying breath of some mechanical beast that had traveled too far and pushed too hard against the relentless southwestern heat. The rider sat motionless for a moment, his leather-clad frame imposing even in stillness, before pulling off his helmet to reveal a face carved by decades of hard living, deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much violence and beauty and loss, a salt and pepper beard that couldn't quite hide the scar running from his left ear to his jaw like a roadmap of survival, hands that gripped the handlebars with the desperate tension of a man whose entire world had just collapsed beneath him, in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Harold watched from his porch as the stranger dismounted with the careful movements of someone fighting pain both physical and emotional, his heavy boots striking the asphalt with finality as he crouched beside his wounded machine. And when the biker exhaled in frustration, the sound carried across the quiet street with such raw vulnerability that Harold felt a familiar ache stir in his chest, the same protective instinct that had driven him to bandage scraped knees and fix broken toys when his son Michael was small. Without conscious decision, but with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of helping strangers, Harold stepped down from the porch and began walking toward the stranded rider, each step on the scalding pavement, a small act of rebellion against the careful isolation he'd cultivated since Martha's death, his arthritic knees protesting the sudden deviation from his morning routine, while his heart hammered with an excitement he hadn't felt in years. The thrill of being needed by someone whose story he didn't yet know, but whose desperation he recognized, with the clarity that comes from having lived through his own dark seasons. The closer he got, the more details emerged, like a photograph developing in slow motion. The intricate patches adorning the rider's leather vest that spoke of loyalty and brotherhood, and miles traveled in the company of men who understood the language of the road. The way his work-hardened hands trembled slightly as they explored the damaged tire with the gentleness of someone who knew that machines, like people, responded better to care than force. The smell of motor oil and leather, and something else that Harold recognized as the particular desperation of a man whose lifeline had just been severed without warning or mercy. "Looks like you caught a nasty one there," Harold said, his voice cutting through the morning heat with the easy confidence of someone who had spoken these same words to countless strangers over the decades. And the biker's head snapped up with the quick wariness of someone who'd learned through hard experience that strangers usually meant trouble, that kindness was often a mask worn by people who wanted something in return, that the world was generally divided between those who would help and those who would hurt, with precious little middle ground between the two extremes. The man's eyes, steel, gray, and sharp, as broken glass, studied Harold with an intensity that would have sent most suburban retirees scurrying back to their air-conditioned safety and locked doors and the comfortable anonymity of avoiding involvement. But Harold saw an unexpected vulnerability beneath the intimidating exterior, a flicker of surprise that someone had approached instead of retreating, that someone had offered words of assistance instead of silence or judgment, or the kind of fear that makes people cross streets and avoid eye contact and pretend they haven't noticed when their fellow human beings are struggling. "Name's Harold," he continued, extending a hand marked by decades of honest work, his time-carved fingers permanently stained with traces of motor oil that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. "I've got tools in the garage and a patch kit that might get you back on the road, assuming you're not in too much of a hurry to let an old man take a look at what's troubling your machine." The biker hesitated, his gaze moving from Harold's genuine expression to the modest house behind him, taking in the American flag and the carefully tended garden and the oil stains on the driveway that spoke of a man who understood machines and the people who depended on them, who knew that sometimes the difference between being stranded and being mobile was nothing more than the willingness of one stranger to help another without asking questions or expecting payment or judging the circumstances that had led to the moment of need. "Danny," the stranger finally said, his voice rough as sandpaper, but carrying an unexpected warmth as his bear-like grip engulfed Harold's smaller one, with strength that spoke of discipline tempered by gentleness, and together they began the slow process of rolling the heavy motorcycle up the driveway, past the garden she'd left behind, flowers blooming defiantly in the scorching morning light. The garage door creaked open on well-oiled hinges, revealing the cool sanctuary where Harold had spent countless hours breathing life back into broken machines, surrounded by the familiar smell of old motor oil and the well-organized pegboard, where his trusted tools waited like old friends. For the next hour, Harold worked in the comfortable silence that comes when two men find themselves united by a shared understanding of broken things and the patience required to fix them, his experienced hands moving with the muscle memory of 40 years, spent coaxing life back into wounded machines, while Danny watched with growing fascination, occasionally passing tools or steadying parts with the reverence of someone witnessing a master craftsman at work. The garage, filled with the familiar sounds of Harold's trade, the soft hiss of the tire patch adhering, the rhythmic clicking of the pressure gauge, the gentle whoosh of air, finding its proper place. And Danny found himself talking about things he'd never shared with strangers, about the brotherhood that had pulled him back from the edge of self-destruction after his discharge from the army, about the way the open road had become both sanctuary and teacher, about the code that bound his club together through loyalty forged in shared miles and mutual protection. "You remind me of my old man," Danny said quietly, as Harold tested the patch with gentle pressure, his voice carrying the weight of complicated grief and hard-earned wisdom. "He was a mechanic too. Tried to teach me the trade before I got too stupid and angry to listen." Harold paused in his work, recognizing the particular pain that comes from understanding something precious only after it's been lost. And when he looked up, their eyes met with the kind of recognition that transcends age, background, and the vast differences in the paths they'd walked. "Good fathers leave marks on more than just their sons," Harold said simply, his words carrying across the space between them like a benediction. And recognition flickered across Danny's expression, a softening that spoke of wounds beginning to acknowledge the possibility of healing. 20 minutes later, when the repair was complete, and they had wheeled the motorcycle back into the intense morning light, its engine purring with renewed life after Harold's gentle ministrations, Danny reached into his vest pocket and extracted a roll of bills that could have covered Harold's grocery expenses for a month. But the old man waved it away with the same casual gesture he might use to brush off dust. "Pass it forward when you can," Harold said, the phrase carrying more weight than currency ever could. And Danny understood that he'd just received something far more valuable than mechanical assistance. He'd been given a reminder of what his father had tried to teach him about decency, about the quiet heroism found in helping strangers without expectation of reward. As Danny mounted his bike and the engine roared to life beneath him, he turned back to see Harold walking back toward his porch, coffee mug in hand once more, watching him disappear around the corner, with the expression of a father seeing his son off on a long journey. And in that moment, Danny made a decision that would ripple outward through the intricate network of brotherhood and loyalty that connected his club like invisible threads, a decision that would transform Harold's quiet morning gesture into something larger than either man could have imagined, something that would prove that kindness, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed, but only passed from one soul to another, with interest compounded by gratitude and amplified by the power of men who understand what it means to honor debts that can never truly be repaid. The rumble began as distant thunder rolling across the Arizona landscape the next morning, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself as Harold stepped onto his porch with his usual coffee, the familiar ceramic mug warm in his hands, as he tried to identify the source of the sound that was growing louder, more complex, more purposeful with each passing second. The thunder resolved itself into the synchronized roar of dozens of motorcycle engines as they rounded the corner, transforming Harold's peaceful suburban street into something that belonged in a different world entirely. A river of chrome and leather flowing in perfect formation, 80 Harley-Davidsons moving with the disciplined precision of a military convoy as they filled the normally empty asphalt from curb to curb. Harold's hands trembled as he gripped his coffee mug tighter, the ceramic warm against his palms as he watched the impossible sight unfold before him. 80 riders, dismounting in unison, their movements coordinated by some unspoken understanding as they filled his small front yard, like a leather-clad army, come to pay respects to a fallen hero. Every face bore the battle-scarred marks of roads traveled and battles fought. Every vest carried the same patches that marked them as brothers, bound by loyalty thicker than blood, and at the center of it all stood Danny, his expression serious but warm as he approached the porch with something wrapped in his powerful hands. "You didn't just fix my tire yesterday," Danny called out, his voice carrying easily over the assembled crowd, reaching every corner of Harold's property, and probably half the neighborhood besides. "You reminded me what decent people look like, what my father was trying to teach me before I was too young and stupid to listen." The words hung in the still morning air like a prayer answered. And then the impossible became reality, as the crowd of intimidating strangers began to move with quiet purpose throughout Harold's property. Some working on the sagging fence that Harold had been meaning to repair for 3 years, others trimming the hedges with surprising gentleness, calloused fingers that could break bones carefully, tending his late wife's cherished blooms with the reverence of men who understood what it meant to honor memory through action. Harold stood speechless on his porch, overwhelmed by the sight of 80 men he'd never met, transforming his neglected yard into something beautiful, working without payment or expectation, their synchronized effort creating a symphony of hammers, clippers, and quiet conversation that filled the morning air with purpose and connection. When Danny finally climbed the porch steps and placed the small wrapped package in Harold's trembling hands, the old man's age-marked fingers found inside a brass motorcycle bell polished to mirror brightness, its weight substantial and warm, engraved with words that blurred through his tears. For Harold, guardian angel of Highway 60. As the sun climbed higher and the work continued around him, Harold understood that yesterday's simple act of kindness had rippled outward through networks of brotherhood he'd never imagined, that his choice to help a stranger had created something sacred in his quiet corner of the world. And when the last motorcycle finally rumbled away and silence settled back over his transformed street, Harold stood holding his bell and feeling Martha's presence in the gentle breeze, knowing that some morning gestures change everything, that kindness planted in good soil always returns as something larger than what was sown, and that sometimes the most profound moments arrive disguised as ordinary Tuesday mornings when old men choose to help instead of hiding behind their front doors.